There we go. Awesome. So for those who are missing lecture for various reasons, there's holidays, there's our religious observances coming up. There's a few people traveling for sports teams. If you are feeling under the weather and you're worried it's COVID and need to get a test, obviously don't come. All of that gets handled through the forms that are up on CampusWire. Okay? Fill out those Google Forms, keep in touch with us. That way we will be generous and free in distributing permission to. If you are not feeling well, please stay home, fill out the form for the missing lecture and explain what happened, and we will go ahead and forward it along to you. The lectures will be recorded to Zoom. You'll get access to the file. We'll give you permission to the file if you can't make it. Let's see. Any other questions? Oh, a few other things. Sign up for CampusWire, please. We'll be using CampusWire through this term. Precepts should be assigned. You should be assigned in a precept, but please fill out the Google form again, and Aransha will be in touch with you. Once we're able to put people in precepts, they are able to attend. Precepts start this Friday. That's the first day of precept. Your handout for precept is due 24 hours in advance up on Canvas before precept. All right, your preceptor will grade it, make any comments, and address general concerns with the precept assignment prior to, at the beginning of your precept. Attend first week, nothing is due in advance. If you can do the precept handout in advance, do it. If you can't, don't worry. I hope that makes sense. Like, I don't want people just like going crazy. We will make we will build up this course, but if you have a computer issue or something like that, don't worry about this first week. Just get done what you can. Precept materials are up on GitHub and POL345.student. Religious observances, fill out the Google form and we will make allowances and extensions as necessary. Any questions on administrative things before we get rolling? Okay. So today, the big idea we're going to have today is that comparisons can be either descriptive or causal, and what exactly does that mean? And what I mean by that is sometimes we just want to say there's a difference between these two groups, and sometimes we want to say that this intervention causes something else to happen. And the first step in this chain of thought and this chain of reasoning is building an intuition for when we can say one and when we can say the other. So that's where the course is going to begin. We're going to start out in perhaps the easiest case where we can argue that we're estimating a causal effect, which is an experiment. We'll talk about controlled experiments and field experiments today, and we will go through all of that. Then we'll conclude by talking about why randomization helps to establish a causal claim. What is it specifically that randomization in an experimental setting is doing that's allowing us to isolate an effect? As part of this, we will discuss internal and external validity. The first thing I want to discuss, this figure is several years old, but it's still about the same. This is a figure of women's pay as a percentage of men's pay at different education levels. So for college graduates and high school graduates, from 1980, it stops about 2005. And what you'll notice is that female high school graduates and female college graduates make about 75, female high school graduates and female college graduates make about 75% of the pay of male high school graduates and male college graduates. All right, that is just a descriptive fact. This is the sort of thing that we're going to talk about in this course, because this begs the question, is there gender discrimination in the labor market, right? And not just is there gender discrimination in the labor market, but as social scientists, what sorts of standards of evidence do we need to establish that, right? So while we're talking about gender discrimination, this is just I just want to go through this before we really get going on things. In this course, we're going to talk about real topics. Today, we're going to hit gender discrimination and violence against women. We're going to talk about racial bias in with policing. We're going to talk about evidence on real studies that help to establish or not establish these things as the semester goes on. One of the things I want to convey from the beginning is I'm coming at this, and I just want to tell you my thought process. I'm coming at this from my own place. What's the right way to put it? I just need to put this out there. I am the liberal Ivy League professor that Ben Shapiro warned you about. Okay? So what I mean by that is I'm not in here to indoctrinate you. I mean the exact opposite. But when I'm standing in front of you and I'm talking about real topics that happen today, I'm a guy with an opinion. If you want to argue or challenge or build on that conversation, please. When I'm standing in front of you and I tell you what a T statistic is, I'm a world expert. Understand where I'm coming from in both parts of the course and how the two play together. How can we use basic statistics to understand our beliefs on these issues? As part of this course, I in no way expect you to agree with me on anything. I do want to teach you how to take your deeply held beliefs and then ask yourself, are there studies or ways I could hold my beliefs up to empirical reality so that my beliefs are informed by it? I would never ask you to water them down or muddle your beliefs or tell you both sides have a point. I don't always think that's the case. But what I try to do, what I don't do is say, here's my beliefs, let me find studies that support me. That's not the way I try to go about it. I do have deeply held beliefs, and I'm presuming everyone else in here does as well. I would ask you that to the extent that you can inform them empirically with solid, well-done studies, we should do so, right? And that's sort of the pose I take throughout this course, and that's one of the things I want you to take away. The ability to have informed opinions and make informed judgments. There are some things that studies can't get to, but there are things that they can. And it's in those empirical areas where we can have real conversations, even with people who don't agree with us. So, in this case, is this gender gap caused by discrimination? Like, I look at this and I go, why, of course, look at it. But the social scientist kicks into me and goes, there's all sorts of alternative explanations that could be here. And they're regularly made. I have a higher standard for gender discrimination as causing this gap in wages than simply women make 75 cents on the dollar for comparably educated men. So what would a study like that look like? When I talk about getting evidence for these sorts of things, what are we talking about? So the last slide was entirely descriptive. It was just aggregates of income. In this slide, we're going to talk about a field experiment. It was done about 10 years ago, and it was assessing causality, gender biases in the sciences. The way this study worked, it wanted to assess whether or not gender affects hiring in science labs. One of the nice things about this study is that it's being done at top universities, which are institutions that ostensibly and to a reasonable extent, in fact, champion and further goals, progressive goals or goals of equality or inclusion, like that's part of the institution, right? So we're going to look for this sort of bias in a least likely place, okay? That sort of strategy is often standard in the social sciences because if we can find gender bias in hiring at top universities, oh my gosh, it must be more pervasive than we realized. That's the sort of chain of logic that leads people to select these sorts of cases. So the question is, gender bias is pervasive. There's a whole host of studies on this, but is it there in the sciences? What the authors did was they gathered a list of 127 senior researchers across universities in the sciences, in the hard sciences. As an aside, I'm in political science. That's like what my PhD is in. As a grad student, I was visiting a friend who was doing neurochemistry at MIT. She was in town for a conference. I was talking with her advisor, and he goes, "So what field are you in?" I said, "Political science." And he looks at me and goes, "Oh, a science, really?" And I'm like, "Oh God, okay." But these are people in the hard sciences. I do count the social sciences as a science. That's a different conversation. So what we're going to do, what the study did was it took 127 senior researchers, and it applied a randomization technique called a simple randomization. What that means is it listed the 127 in any order, in a random order, and said, we're gonna put the first person in the control group, the second person in the treatment group, the third person in the control group, the fourth person in the treatment group, all the way down to 127. So I guess at the end there were 63 and 64. I'll tell you what the treatment and control are in a moment, but the important point about the randomization is that it was done totally at random and didn't pay any attention to the faculty to whom the treatment was being administered. The outcomes, so what the authors did was they took identical CVs for graduating undergraduates looking to enter grad school. Absolutely, they had the same CV, it was utterly identical, except one had a male name, one had a female name. So the treatment group are those that had the female name, the control group are those that had the male name, but in this case, you could just flip that either way. It's not that there's an absence of treatment, but it's more that half of them have an identifiably male name, half have an identifiably female name. These were sent out to the 127 researchers, and they were sent out kind of informally saying, here's one of my students, could you take a look at their CV and just assess, would you be willing to hire them in your lab? How competent do you think they are? Would you hire them, and how much mentoring was offered? How much mentoring would you offer, okay? The point that I want to get off first when we talk about field experiments and randomization is how this study differs from the earlier study. It differs from this slide. In this slide, nothing was randomized. These are literally men living their lives going out and earning money, women earning their lives going out and earning money, and those two are compared. This sort of analysis, it's either extremely difficult or oftentimes impossible to isolate an effect of male versus female because there's all other things happening. In this study, because we're using the same resume and the same CV, literally the same CV, we're able to isolate the effect of a person hiring, looking at the resume, the CV, and saying, this person is male, this person is female, whether that's conscious or not. So we're able to isolate the effect we're interested in. When we talk about this in a few slides, we're going to use the phrase internal validity for that, which is isolating the effect that we're interested in. This study has high internal validity. So let's take a look at the results. What you'll notice is, here's a series of bar charts with the results. People were asked to assess the candidates on a measure of 1 to 5. Least likely to most likely, okay? And what you'll notice is that systematically across measures of how competent do you think this person is on a 1 to 5 scale, would you hire this, how hireable is this person, and how much mentoring would you offer? The male CV and got a systematically higher score than the female CV. The one thing we'll talk about as the semester goes on is you see those little bars coming up and down off the big bars. Those are confidence intervals. Just if you've done AP stats, awesome, that's what those are. If you haven't, don't worry about it, we'll get to that. Right now, I want to focus on the idea that randomization is isolating an effect and giving us high internal validity. So systematically, across different measurements, the professors who sent these back said that the CVs with a male candidate were more competent, more hireable, and were more likely to receive mentoring than the female candidates. When we talk about coming back to the idea of pay discrimination, they asked, how much would you pay this person, right? Because a lot of people in the sciences have the ability, at least have a bandwidth with which they can pay grad students or people working for them. And in this case, utterly identical people, except for the name, the gender, received systematically higher payments. In this case, right around maybe $30,200 for males, $26,500 or so for females. Now, when this study came out, it actually made a pretty big impact. And the reason for it is that it's a pretty clear and it's a clean study. And it provides reasonably clear evidence that there is in fact gender discrimination happening in this particular market. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Yeah, we'll finish up talking about this. So what does this allow us to say? This allows us to say at top universities that have science labs, women are generally offered less money and less support and viewed less competent or hireable than observationally equivalent men when looking at CVs. On the one hand, that's a very, very narrow claim, okay? Because this really only applies to science labs. This doesn't tell us anything about the world at large. So on the one hand, it's a very narrow claim, but it has high internal validity in the sense that we do successfully isolate an effective gender, or perceived gender, right? Because the two CVs are identical, we can say, given two observationally equivalent people in terms of education, GPA, test scores, publications, summer research, that sort of thing, men are at an advantage relative to women if they're identical in all other ways, if they're perceived as identical in all other ways by a potential employer. That's what we mean by high internal validity. In this one narrow case, we can find reasonably persuasive evidence of gender discrimination. When we get to a few slides later, we'll talk about external validity, which is, well, we can see it here in the hard sciences at top universities. Is it pervasive through the economy? And those are the two different concerns that we're gonna have to balance continuously throughout the course. Oftentimes, it's easiest to establish a claim in a very narrow setting where you manipulate something. So you can establish it really, really well in a sliver of the economy, right? Like, I'm not sure what proportion of the entire workforce work in labs at the hard sciences at top universities, but it's not a lot, okay? At the same time, we isolate it and we find it cleanly. The concern afterwards is, well, does this show up in other places? And we'll talk about a few other studies that have done similar studies like this, used a similar design. But then what happens is researchers put forth one study and another study and another study. So people have run this in different areas and found the same result in different sectors in different ways. One guiding point of this course is that one study often tells us very little. Once we get 5 or 6 or 7 of these studies, we start to believe there's something happening. So this study kicked off a range of other studies that have found it in different sectors of the economy, to the extent that we can test these things. But now we're starting to get some evidence that perceived gender is causing these changes because we're isolating it. And it's not simply measuring incomes in the world, because we're actually manipulating the perceived gender. The next study is from a paper I read a few years ago, and I finished it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this paper is legitimately important. It is amazing, it is important, and it needs to be shared and read in its findings. And I just committed myself after reading it to front loading it in this course, and it's a field experiment set in Uganda. It deals with violence against women. So to set the stage in Uganda, this comes from a survey, I believe it's a World Values Survey. And the question that was asked in the World Values Survey, it regularly asks, is it acceptable to hit your wife? Sorry, is it acceptable for a wife to be hit under one of these 5 scenarios? And it was like, has a dirty house, the kid's running wild. There were, there were 5 total circumstances. These results are the results to that question from female respondents in Uganda and across the world, saying it's acceptable for a woman, for a husband to discipline his wife by hitting her in one of these 5 scenarios. And for that, amongst female respondents, about 73% of the females in Uganda said that was acceptable. Okay? To give you an idea, the number drops down to 0. I identified the US on here earlier. Or maybe it's not on this. But this is East Africa, where those numbers are just often high, okay? So this is, we'll hit a few different data sets and studies that deal with the issue of violence against women. This is just one of the first ones we're hitting. So when we talk about the research design of this particular study, it turns out that in rural Uganda, the penetration of TVs is not very deep. There's just not most people don't have televisions. There's, in the town center in rural Uganda, there's just a single building with a film projector. And the town, most of the town meets at that film center. And what these authors did was they took 6 consecutive weekends and showed 6 different films all throughout Uganda over 6 consecutive weekends at these town centers. And in the middle, they put a PSA, a public service announcement. So what would happen was there'd be the film, there'd be a public service announcement. Some people would stay and watch it. Some people would go outside and smoke. Some people would just not pay any attention whatsoever. But they put these public service announcements in the middle of the movie during the intermission, and then folks watched the second half. They varied the content of the public service announcements, and we'll talk about the different ones that they put in. But what they wanted to know is it possible for these PSAs, if they discourage violence against women, can it lead to a measurable decrease in actual reported violence against women? So the 3 treatment conditions, I'm putting a few of them together, but they included a violence against women vignette, and they talk in the paper about where it comes from. We'll talk, we don't need to get into all that, but it's discouraging violence against women. Okay, it's just a 3 or 4 minute PSA in the middle of the movie. Then there's a violence against women vignette and an abortion message. Then there was just an abortion message. Then there were other placebos, where there was the placebo public service announcement, encourage teachers to show up and teach schools because they kind of weren't paid. Okay, so that was taken as the placebo. The way they assign the treatment, and whenever you see a field experiment, ask how did you assign the treatment? They did something called block randomization. And I think it shows up, yeah, we'll get to the block randomization. What blocking does is it takes, in this case, they took clusters of 7 villages that were by each other, that were geographically proximate over all of Uganda, and then within those clusters assigned 1 to each of the 7 different treatment conditions at random. The idea of blocking is we create homogeneous subsets of units in our experiment, and we randomize within those homogeneous subsets. So in this case, it reduces the variance in our estimate tremendously. We'll run through different examples of this as the course goes on. A few different interesting things about this design. It was called this type of design is called an encouragement design. When you play a movie in the middle of town, you can't make people show up. And when you play the movie, you can't make people show up for the PSA. Some folks just left. So residents were encouraged, not forced, to view these. Some language. The people in the village who showed up and watched the PSAs and sat through the intermission PSAs are called compliers. Why? Because they complied with the treatment, with the intended treatment. Not everybody complied. Some people in the village did have television. Some people didn't come out to the movie, right? They just didn't like Vin Diesel. Some people went outside during the intermission. Some people weren't paying attention because of their parents or kids or whatnot. One point I want to make is that the average treatment effect on the compliers should be larger than the average effect on the village as a whole. Why is that? Because the village as a whole is a mixture of people who saw the PSAs and people who didn't. Whereas the people who did in fact see the PSAs should have a larger effect because they're not diluted by people who didn't receive the treatment. The one other interesting part of this design is how this was measured. So one idea we're going to discuss is this idea of a Hawthorne effect, which is that if people know they're in a study about it, if people know they're in a study or know they're in a study about a particular question, they may change their answers. So in order to mask the goal of this study, the researchers went back at, I believe, 6 months and 12 months. And the questions they asked the survey, the people in the village, were actually, there were about 55 questions and they only wanted 1 or 2. They turned it into a general questionnaire on political and social life to mask what they were really asking about. All right? And the importance of that is if people knew what the PSAs were about and what the researchers were interested in, they might have adjusted their answers. Okay. So this is an excerpt from the media campaign itself. They, I'll just leave this up. You can take a look at it, but these are excerpts from the videos. One point I do want to make, if you read through the paper itself, they spend time talking about when they did their field experiment, they piloted. And a pilot for a field experiment is running the experiment on a small group of convenience to make sure it works. You don't report the results in the final paper, but if you're ever going to run an experiment, a field experiment or a lab experiment or anything with, as part of your JP senior thesis future work, always run a pilot. And that's just where you get the kinks out, okay? So they hired a production company to put together these videos. And their first video actually said, don't commit violence against women. That was the message of it. And that actually didn't get any cultural traction because of where they were. And the actual videos that they showed, the message was, don't commit too much violence. Don't really hurt the person, discipline. And that was the only one that actually got cultural traction in their study. And I'll direct you back to the study on that. So if we go through, here we see a woman saying, this is not right. This is just not right. Poor woman. And that's one of the PSAs. If I said something, maybe this wouldn't have happened, right? And that's after someone who died. And these were what were shown in the middle of the movies. I mentioned the blocking in terms of the treatment assignment a few slides ago. And the blocking is set up like this. Each of the colors, this is a map of rural Uganda, and to the extent that there's been studies of Uganda, most of it have dealt with the urban areas of Kampala and the surrounding areas. So we actually, as political scientists and social scientists, know urban areas, generally speaking, throughout the world better than rural areas, especially in East Africa. So this was one of the first studies to ever actually go into this part of the world. Now, when I was talking about blocking, you see the different colors of the cities on the slide. You'll notice that each of the colors has exactly 7 cities or 7 villages. So what the authors did was they said, we're going to choose 7 villages over here, and within these 7 villages, randomize which PSA you get. 7 villages over here, 7 over here, 7 over there. And they did it by color, they did it geographically to ensure that in each homogeneous subset of the villages, the distribution of treatments was the same, but also that there was no imbalance and that one of the PSAs, that one of the treatment conditions wasn't overrepresented in the West versus the South, or something like this. And this gives us a better balance in our treatment. Here we see the timeline for the study. Here's the placebo condition, absenteeism, anti-violence against women, and here are the 7 different treatment conditions. So I guess the placebo had, there was a placebo condition, and I forgot exactly what that message was, but here's the absenteeism with teachers, there was an abortion message, and the different combinations. Each one of these dots is a village. And they showed the same movie each day, once a week for 6 weeks. Then there was a set of midline follow-ups, which was 4 months later. This happened in the subsequent, so this was August to September, then right around mid-November, plus or minus, they went back and they conducted these surveys at all the villages where the movies were shown. One of the concerns with field experiments is that the effect dissipates. So after you see the PSA, you might be like, oh my God, that changed me, but 6 months later, it might just be gone. The authors were looking for long-lasting effects, so they went back not just at the midline in mid-November, but the end line in June the following year to see if there was still an effect. They wanted to know if they could shift the culture on these issues in these areas. One other thing when we talk about field experiments and you read them in the social sciences, be a little wary if someone gives a treatment and then follows up with the person 6 minutes later, right? We want to know not just 6 minutes later, does your opinion on something change or does your behavior change? But in fact, we want to know what sort of lasting change can this intervention cause? All right. We are going to talk in this course, we're going to speak in this course about something called balance checks. Now, a balance check involves comparing the treatment group and the control group to make sure they look similar. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea behind an experiment is that if we randomize the treatment between a treatment group and a control group, the treatment group and the control group are similar in all ways except for the treatment condition. So I know that it's not something else driving the desired effect, it is actually the treatment itself. And one way to assess this in experiments or in observational studies is to do a balance check. If you have a treatment group and a control group, you can look at the variables in your data and say, does the distribution of the variables in the treatment group and the control group look the same? If all of our variables look the same, then we're reasonably certain that it's the treatment that's actually causing the difference, right? It's not one of these other variables that's different between the two groups. So in this study, these are actually the movies they showed. And they wanted to show in this particular, there's pages of balance checks at the end of this. But what they wanted to illustrate in this particular study, in this particular figure, is that attendance at the movies was the same between the treatment and control condition. All right, so that the treatment and control condition, there was nothing, the PSAs weren't driving attendance. If the PSAs were actually driving attendance, imagine the case where one of the PSAs offended the village so much that they stopped coming. That would just create havoc on this study. So here we can see that just by eyeballing it, and often with balance checks, eyeballing it does fine. Here are the different movies. Pirates of the Caribbean, Slumdog Millionaire, Spy? Who's in Spy? Oh, Melissa, oh, yeah, okay. The Fast and the Furious 7. Not my favorite of the Fast and Furious. I'm kidding, I've never seen any, but are they worth watching? Okay, yeah, it's a couple, okay. We'll talk about Nick Cage later in the semester. Creed and Oz the Great. Okay, so those are the different movies that they showed. And the concern from this particular figure was that one of the PSAs was just affecting attendance down the line. Do you see any difference in attendance between the two groups? No. It passes the balance check. There are formal statistical tests that will be running through this course, but honestly, every chance you have to plot your data and look at it, do so. That's more persuasive than a single statistic being returned. Okay. Distinguishing between internal and external validity is key, and this lecture has been about internal validity. Okay, internal validity, a study is internally valid if it successfully isolates the effect of interest. That's what it is. The most internally valid type of study we know involves randomization. And I'll give you a typology of different types of experiments, but for now, what I need you to understand is that randomization gives us internal validity, because by making the treatment and control conditions similar in all regards except for the treatment condition itself, then we can attribute any difference in outcome to the treatment. All right, so if the treatment and control are identical except for the treatment condition, then if there's a difference in outcomes, that's what it is. External validity is this question of, well, we can find these results in rural Uganda, but is this general? outside of these villages does it hold? Does it hold in other countries? Does it hold in other cultures? Does it hold in other times? Does it hold on other issues? And those are the sorts of questions that external validity gets at. The strategy of this course will be to focus on field and natural experiments to get internally valid estimates. And then we'll talk about descriptive studies where people gather data, massive amounts or sometimes just small amounts, to establish external validity. So in the context of a study, if we see results that look like we're about to see them, we're like, oh, hey, we found something in this one case. After you find things in a few different cases, then you can look around with descriptive studies and you build up a stronger case that this is a general social phenomenon. So going back to Uganda, the Ugandan study is a field experiment. What that means is that the researcher controls the treatment assignment, but that's it. And does the psych department still require that like you folks go and do those experiments for them? Is that still a thing? Was how many hours a semester or whatever? Is it 12 hours a semester? I am underutilizing you. Kidding, I'm not. But so was it 12? Was that the actual number? How many hours is it a semester? We don't know. Okay. There is some number. And when you do, oh, okay, was that a 4? Fantastic, thank you. Could you put that on campus wire just so we get in the habit of that? Cool. All right. I'm just psyched to get this on campus wire. So when you do these experiments in the psychology department, they're controlled experiments because the researcher controls the environment and the treatment and measures an outcome. This is a field experiment where the researcher controls the treatment, but not the environment. The researchers were not controlling Uganda writ large as part of this. They were just controlling the treatments and then letting the social world do what it does. All right. So in this case, unlike a laboratory, we can't ensure that all the factors are controlled for. What sorts of concerns show up in a field experiment that don't in a lab experiment? I've listed 3 here. Spillover. One concern in the world is that people leave after the PSAs and talk about them to people who didn't even go. That's a concern. A second concern, unobserved factors. Let's imagine that some of the cities, some of the villages were randomly affected by something that we don't know about that could drive these results. There could be some disease or a catastrophe or something that only affects certain groups that we don't know about. A last concern is misadministration or misperception, and this shows up in field experiments quite a bit, especially when the field experiment is developed by people in one cultural milieu and try and do it elsewhere, right? It's just not perceived. The researcher often intends a treatment to be perceived a certain way. That doesn't mean it is. So focusing on the results on violence. Awesome. Okay. On slide 13, I will get down into the groove of keeping this up and keeping better with this. There's a question on campus wire. What do the dots denote on group 13? Each one of those is a village from the study. Okay. So in this case, looking at the results of effects on violence. This is the effect of the treatment of the violence against women PSAs on the number of incidents, whether there's any incidents, and the frequency of violence. And these are all self-reported from the follow-up surveys at midline and endline. So in this case, the other line I want you to just be aware of is the sample. These results come from all women in the survey. These results come from women compliers who are women who reported going to the movie and watching the PSAs. Okay. So these are all the women, these are women compliers, all the women and women compliers. All right. what you'll notice is that there was actually an estimated decrease for number of incidents for all three different subsets. Sorry, across all three measures. In this case, we're going to start, we'll talk about statistical significance down the line. For right now, if you see an asterisk, it's statistically significant. We'll build all that out over the course of the semester. But in this case, we find three significant effects where the treatment group, which are women, in this case, all women and women compliers, in the villages where there were PSAs designed to stop violence against, designed to discourage violence against women, there were actually fewer reported, there were fewer households that reported any incidents of violence because of it. So the original study talked about how they ended up discouraging something on the order of 10,000 acts of reported violence by just aggregating this up to the total size of the area they looked at. There's also an effect on violent frequency, the frequency of violence. So if there is violence, there's a lower frequency of violence in village where they showed those PSAs discouraging violence against women. In this case, and the last point I want to make from this is that the effect is minus 0.132 on women who complied with the study, with the encouragement of the design, and minus 0.048 on all women. That's a sensible result, and we might talk about papers that separate compliers from the entire sample, because all the women in the study involved those who went and saw the PSAs and those who didn't. So their treatment effect should be attenuated for the whole group because it's a mixture of people who got the treatment and people who didn't. If you isolate the people who received the treatment, it should have an effect that's larger in magnitude because the folks who actually took the treatment up is a larger proportion of that sample. Okay. One critique of experiments that we'll discuss is, and it's a subtle philosophical distinction, is these find effects but not mechanisms, right? So they go through, they did this amazing study, they discouraged, I don't want to call it countless acts, it's on the order of tens of thousands of violent acts, did this amazing study trying that measured the effect of informing the public on violence against women. We estimated an effect, and it's a causal effect, at least on its face, attributable to the intervention that the authors implemented. The question we have, though, is why? Through what mechanism did it work? Okay? And here's where I'm going to stop regularly through the course and ask people just to check inside their own intuition and head as to what a plausible mechanism might be. Let's imagine that you are a man in rural Uganda who has been practicing his culture's views on violence against women to maintain discipline in the household. You've done it, your father has done it, his father has done it, and you have holy scripture that tells you this is okay. Is it the case that a 4-minute PSA during Fast and Furious 7 is going to make you rethink your opinion on these issues? Am I getting a whole bunch of no's mumbled under their breaths? Yes, that's correct. So that's not a plausible mechanism. That men are going to watch this and go, oh my gosh, my entire cultural view has been misogynistic. Oh wait, Spy is starting again. Okay, that's not how this works. What moves this paper from amazing to brilliant is they managed to track down a plausible mechanism within the study itself. And the point I want to make is as you read studies for me or for your other classes, when they find effects, ask them, did they pin down a mechanism? And that's the important part because it's the mechanism that's going to carry and give us external validity. It's the mechanism that's going to go from this environment to that environment to that environment that's going to carry through from one study to another, from one situation to another, once we know the mechanism. So what mechanism did they find? Well, what they ended up showing, here's the effect on women reporting. When they did the study, when they did the follow-up surveys, they asked, the women, did you report violent acts that men had committed? And there was an upsurge in reporting by women. A couple different points of this. There were a number of people you could have reported to: parents, a counselor, this is a local chairperson, the police, and a reporting index is an average of other measures. Okay, so in this case, the midline to the end line, it went from 0.09 to 0.14, 0.07 to 0.17. So what they're showing is that the effect of reporting actually increased. They shifted the culture on reporting. So in this case, what the authors have demonstrated is that women were more likely to report to officials in one way or another that violence was too much and out of hand. In essence, this is doing something that at least resonates with Me Too, with the Me Too movement, in that it was de-anonymizing and de-isolating violence. It changed the violence against women from something that women did not talk about to something that they did talk about. It was never okay. No one ever thought it was okay, especially what was targeted here. But it moved from something we don't talk about, that women don't talk about, to something women do talk about. I slipped in a we in there that we talk about or not, and as a male, it turns out men didn't. If you look at this, there was a little bit at midline with men reporting a little bit more, but the effect disappears. And if you compare the two estimates, it's notably higher in magnitude for women. So the result of the PSAs that they showed that tried to discourage violence against women is that it led to women reporting when they saw too much violence being done to officials, the police, that sort of thing. And that was the mechanism they found. And the mechanism, in fact, operated through women and not men. It was the randomization that gives us the internal validity. People weren't selecting into PSAs. And in this case, it's the mechanism that allows us to assess external validity. Because we do know that, so now when these studies get run again, we can ask, is there an increase in reporting that we see? And that gives us a plausible mechanism that might actually be applied elsewhere. I will see you all next lecture.